Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we have discussed about what is Spring Boot application. This annotation used at start class of Spring Boot. This annotation is equal to below three annotations. One is boot configuration. Another one is enable auto configuration. Third one is component scanning. What is this component scanning? The process of scanning the packages in the application to identify the bean classes is called as component scanning. Component scan is built-in concept. Component scan is a built-in concept. Component scanning will start from base package of the application. So the package which contains the start class is called as base package. All the remaining packages which are starting with the base package are called as sub packages. Right. So if you consider this as a base package, all these packages comes under sub packages because they are starting with the base package name. For example, if you take this package, it is not a sub package, so this package will not participate in the component scanning. We can specify more than one base package also in our boot start class. Like this, we can write the custom component scan annotation. We can specify more than one base package here. Now, what is bean annotation? So whenever we go for @component, whenever we go for @component annotation at the class level, IOC container will create the object for that class. When we go for @component annotation, IOC container will create the object for that class, right? Now, if we don't want IOC, if we don't want IOC to create the object, if we don't want IOC to create the object, then we need to write the logic to create the object by using @bean annotation. So here I am writing the logic to create the object for app security class because I want to customize the security. I want to customize security. One second. Is there? I want to customize the security for my application. In order to customize the security, I'm writing my own method. For that method, I'm writing @bean annotation. So this bean annotation method I'm keeping inside my configuration class. Okay. If you want IOC to create the object for a class, if you want IOC to create the object for a class, then you can use component annotation. If you want to create the object for the class on your own, then you will write a method by using @bean annotation. Are you clear with this? Now, here there are several annotations are available. How to represent Java class as a Spring Bean? How to represent Java class as a Spring Bean? Now, here we have several annotations. We have several annotations. One is component annotation is available. Next one, service annotation is available. And the next one, repository is available. In future, we are going to work with the controller and REST controller, and we are using @configuration, @configuration, and @bean. So these are the annotations we are using to represent our Java class as a Spring Bean. @component, @service, @repository. So these annotations we are using to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. When we go for web application development, to represent our class as a controller class, we will use @controller annotation. To represent our class as a distributed component, we are going to use @REST controller annotation, and we will use @configuration. To represent our customized configurations, we will use @configuration. and we will use @bean. All the above annotations are class level. All the above annotations are class level annotations, but bean is, but only bean is method level annotation. Got my point? Component service repository controller, REST controller, configuration, and bean. All the above annotations are class level annotations, but bean is method level annotation. Okay, now here, sir, these annotations are used to represent the Java class as a Spring Bean. But to represent the Java class as a Spring Bean, why why three annotations are available? What is the difference between them? Component is a general purpose annotation. Component is a general purpose annotation to represent Java class as Spring Bean. At component is a general purpose annotation. It is used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. Now, service annotation is also used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. But what is the difference between this service and a component? Let us see the documentation of the service annotation. First, let's see the documentation of the component annotation. We can go inside this component. Indicates that annotated class is a component. Such classes are considered as candidates for auto detection when using annotation based configuration and class path scanning. So whenever we use this component, those classes will be considered as auto detection candidates as part of configuration based with annotations or class path scanning. Class level annotation may be considered as identifying a component as well. Typically, a special kind of components repository aspect also comes under this category. So this component is a general purpose annotation to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Now, service annotation is available. What is the purpose of that service annotation? Service is also used to represent our Java class as a Spring Bean. Go to service, indicates that annotated class is a service originally defined by domain driven design as an operation offered as an interface that stands alone in the model with no encapsulated state. May also indicates that business service facade or something similar. This annotation is a general purpose stereotype and individual teams may narrow their semantics to use the appropriate. The annotation serves as a specialization of the component, allowing for implementation classes to be auto-detected through class path scanning. This is also a specialization of component. So this service and component annotations are belongs to same family. Component is a annotation to represent the Java class as a Spring Bean. Service is also used to represent the Java class as a Spring Bean. So basically, when you write a interface and you will implement that interface for business logic. So the business classes, the classes which are implementing an interface with the business logic, to represent them as a Spring Bean, we are using @service annotation. This annotation serves as a specialization of component. That means it is a specialization. That means it is related to component family. It is related to component family, allowing for implementation classes to be auto detected through class path scanning. Okay, whenever we have a interface, those implementation classes will be defined as a Spring Beans. So service annotation is a specialization of component. Is a specialization of component. This is also used to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Service annotation is a specialization of component annotation. This is also used to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Understood? It will allowing to implementation classes to be auto detected through class path scanning. This annotation serves as a specialization of component. It is allowing implementation classes to be auto detected through class path scanning. That means now when we are having an interface and we are having implementation classes, those implementation classes will be auto detected through class path scanning with this service annotation. It is also a family member of component. Next one, we have repository annotation. Repository annotation is available. By using repository annotation also, we are doing this class as a Spring Bean. We are making this class as a Spring Bean. Let's go to repository. Now see here, documentation of the repository indicates that class is a repository originally defined by domain driven design mechanism. Teams implementing traditional JE patterns such as the data access object may also apply this stereotype to DAO classes. So now if you have any logic for data access like DB communications, such kind of classes can be represented as Spring Bean by using repository annotation. And there is a special behavior. A class thus annotated is eligible for Spring translation when used in conjunction with persistence exception translation post processor. So whatever the SQL exceptions we are getting from the database, whenever we interact with the database, what are the SQL exceptions we are getting from the database? These repository annotations are going to translate that exception into data access exceptions by using this post processor. Okay. This annotation also serves as a specialization of component, allowing for implementation classes to be auto detected through class path. This annotation, a class thus annotated is eligible for Spring translation exception, data access exception translation when conjunction with this persistent translation post processor. At repository annotation is a specialization of component. Repository annotation is a specialization of at component annotation. At component annotation, this is also used to represent. This is also used to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Repository annotation is a specialization of component. This is also used to represent the Java class as Spring Bean. Java class as Spring Bean. It is having the capacity. It will convert exceptions. It is having exception translation functionality. It is having data access exception translations. So whatever the database error we are getting, it is going to convert that into understandable error for the Java programmers. So when we interact with the database, you may get some exception with the SQL. That exception will be converted. It is going to translate that exception into our Java programmers understandable format. So for everyone, for every annotation, there is a functionality. Component is a general purpose annotation to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Service annotation is a specialization of component. This is used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. It is allowing for implementation classes to be auto detected through class path scanning. Repository annotation is a specialization of component annotation. This is used for representing Java class as a Spring Bean. It is having data access exception translations. Exception translation. Example, for a DAO classes, we will use at repository. Okay. For business classes, we will use service. for business classes, we will use @service annotation. Okay. For DAO classes, we will use @repository annotation. Okay, guys. How to represent our Java class as a Spring Bean? So there are several annotations are available. Component, service, repository. Component is a general purpose annotation to represent our Java classes as Spring Bean. Okay, right. Now, component, service, repository. Component is a general purpose. Service is used for business classes. Repository is used for DAO classes. Controller annotation. When we have a application with a UI, web application for customer to business. In web application, we will use controller, and in web applications, to represent Java class as controller, we will use @controller annotation. In web applications, to represent Java class as controller, we will use @controller annotation. It is used for C2B, customer to business communication. That means a UI will be available. User interface. When you have a user interface, so after processing the request, send the response to the UI. In that scenario, we will go for controller annotation. In distributed application, to represent Java class as a distributed component, that means B2B communications. In distributed applications, to represent Java class as a distributed component, that means if one application want to communicate with another application, then we are going to use REST controller. It is used for B2B communications. That means one application want to communicate with another application, no UI, there is no user interface. One application will send a request to the another application will process the request, will send the response. So in the distributed application, to represent the Java class as a distributed component, we will use REST controller annotation. REST controller annotation. It is used for B2B communication. That means no user interface. Here, when you go for a controller will process the request. Controller will send the response to the user interface. That is called C2B communication, customer to business. When it comes to the B2B, it is a business to business communication. One application will send the request to another application directly. Data will be exchanged between the applications, no user interface. When your web application is having a user interface, then you should go for controller. When your application don't have user interface, only B2B communication, then go for REST controller. Are you guys clear with my point? How to represent a Java class as a Spring Bean? These are the annotations. Next one, configuration. If we want to perform customized configurations, then we will use @configuration annotation. When we use configuration annotation, object will be created for the configuration class by the IOC container. Object will not be created for the configuration class by IOC container. Guys, password utils available. Okay, now here, when we create a particular class, separate class, object will be created for the configuration class also, or object will not be created for the configuration class, will be created, object will be created for the configuration class also. Okay, now here basically let me make it as new class as app config. I am keeping this in the config package. Inside the config package, I am writing the logic to create the security class object. App security object. This class I am making as a configuration class. I'm making this class as a configuration class. It is responsible to create the object for app security. There is @bean method. There is @bean method. Okay. App security class available. For this class, I am writing one app config class. So I want to customize the object creation for app security. Here I am writing @configuration. This class is represented as a configuration class. Now let me write a constructor for app config system.out.println app config. Inside the constructor, I'm writing SOP to understand when that constructor getting executed. Inside the app config, I'm writing a bean method. It is used to create the object for app security. This class is represented as a configuration class by using @configuration annotation. So for app security is one class. It is used to secure our application. I don't want IOC to create the object for this class. I don't want IOC to create the object for this class because I have a special requirement. I want to create the object for this class on my own. I want to manage the configuration. I want to manage the dependency of this class. So here I'm writing just app security class. For this, I'm creating the object in the app config class because app config is a configuration. Like this, I'm creating the object by using @bean. IOC is going to call this method. We'll consider this object as a Spring Bean. Now see, for app config object will be created or not, which is having a configuration annotation. Right click, run as boot app, run as boot app. The bean create instance could not be registered. A bean with that name has already been registered in the class path app config. Okay. Is there any class already registered with app config? Car, motor, app config, user DAO, user security, app security, user service. Okay, refresh. Run as boot application. Now you see, for app config, the object is created. When I give the annotation as a configuration, the object is creating for that configuration class. Object is not creating for the configuration class, guys. Object is creating for the configuration class. Object is not creating for the configuration class. For app config, object is creating for the app config. Object is not creating for the app config. Object is creating for the app config. So is it calling app security create instance method? Is this method is getting called or this method is not getting called? Bean method. Bean method is called. That's why app security object is created. So that constructor is getting executed. Basically, app security is not represented as a Spring Bean through annotation. Inside the app config class, I'm writing the method by using @bean. IOC is calling this method, representing this class as a Spring Bean. Representing this class as a Spring Bean. Okay, right. Now, so to represent customized configurations, we will use configuration classes. Example, swagger config, db config, rest template config, kafka config, redis config, security config. Like this in the project, multiple customized configurations we need to do as per our requirement. Swagger we are going to configure for generating the documentation for the REST API. If I want to connect with multiple databases from the Spring Boot application, then I need to do the DB configurations for that. If I want to access one REST API from another REST API, then I need to use the REST template for that. I need to do the customized configuration. My REST API wants to talk to Kafka, then I need to do Kafka configurations. My REST API want to talk to Redis server, I need to do the Redis configuration. In my project, I want to implement security concept, then I need to write that security config. So like that, there are n number of use cases will be available when we are working in the real project. So when you want to customize these configurations, then definitely you need to take one class as a config class and you need to write that configuration. And but actually in the real time, what will happen? For every configuration, for Swagger configuration, one Swagger config will be class will be created with configuration annotation. For a DB configuration, one DB config class will be created. For REST template, one REST template config class will be created. For Kafka configuration, Kafka config class will be created. That means multiple configuration classes will be created in the project. Multiple configuration classes will be created in the project. For example, if you see here, I want to go for Kafka in my project, then Kafka config. So here we are going to write @configuration annotation. @configuration annotation. So now here I am writing constructor system.out.println this. Now inside this Kafka configuration class, we will write the methods which are responsible methods for configuration. Bean method for the configuration. @bean method for configuration. Whatever the configuration that we want to do by using Kafka, whatever the configuration that we want to do, whatever the configuration that we need to communicate with the Kafka, those methods we are going to write in the Kafka config class. Whatever the methods we want to do for security config, Swagger config, Redis config, like that, multiple configuration classes we are going to create to customize these configurations in our application. Right now, see, Kafka config class is created. Can you see here, guys? Kafka config is created or not? Kafka config object is created. App config object is created. Similarly, we can create security config, Redis config also in the real time. Good. Now, here, guys, I have a question. Whatever the bean method I'm writing, is it mandatory to keep this bean method only in the configuration class, or you can keep this in any Spring Bean class? Whatever the bean method we are writing, is it mandatory to keep the bean method only in the configuration class, or we can keep in the any Spring Bean class? We can keep it in any Spring Bean class, but it is recommended to keep in the configuration classes. You can write this in any Spring Bean, but recommended to write in the configuration class. Okay. Now we will use configuration annotation along with bean methods. All right. So I hope you got the clarity. What is a component? What is a service? What is a repository? What is a controller? What is a REST controller? What is configuration? What is bean? Component, service, repository annotations are called as stereotype annotations. They are used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. Sir, what is the purpose of three? Why three annotations are there to represent class as a Spring Bean? The functionality is different. Repository annotation used for the database access layer, where exceptions can be translated. Service annotation will be used for the business layer, where implementation classes also will be scanned as part of component scanning. Component is a general purpose annotation, which is used to represent the class as a Spring Bean. Controller is used to represent Java class as a Spring controller, which will deal with web requests. Whenever a request comes, it will handle that request. It will send the response to the UI. REST controller means it is a distributed component which is used for B2B communication. Instead of XML, if you want to use a Java class for the configuration, then we will use @configuration annotation. In the configuration annotation, to customize the bean object creations, then we will write bean annotation for the method. IOC container will call that bean methods. @bean annotated methods we can keep in any Spring Bean class, but recommended to keep in the configuration class. @bean annotated method we can keep in any Spring Bean class. We can keep in any Spring Bean class, but it is highly recommended. It is highly recommended to keep them in configuration class, because if I am creating this, if I am writing this bean method, inside some other classes, can people easily understand what configuration we are doing? If I keep this method in the other classes, can people understand what configuration I am doing? No. If you keep in the config class, then it will have more readability. People also can easily understand what are the customized configurations we are doing in our project. Okay. So bean method you can keep @bean annotated method we can keep in any Spring Bean class, but it is highly recommended to keep them in configuration class. In configuration classes, can we have multiple configuration classes in the project? Can we have multiple configuration classes in the project? Based on requirement, we can have multiple configuration classes in the project. Based on the requirement, we can have multiple configuration classes in the project, like Swagger config, DB config, REST template config, Kafka config, Redis config, security config. Like that, we can write multiple configuration classes and we can use them as per our requirement. I hope this concept is clear, guys. Clear for all of you? Why they are called as a stereotype? Why they are called as stereotype annotations? Even that is just a name that they mentioned, and I don't think there is a special meaning for that. Stereotype meaning. View or represent as a stereotype. Stereotype meaning in Spring. Hence the name stereotype. It is making our classes as it is simplifying our classes. So Spring does not care much about the details of your class. From the Spring perspective, your classes are either repository, service, controller. If it is not does not belongs to any of that, then it's just a component. Spring is just making over simplification of your classes, hence the name is stereotype. So String is not bothering about what is that class is all about. It is just making that class as a Spring Bean. As it is making the simplifying of your classes, they will named it as stereotype. कुछ मतलब ही नहीं है भाई. Right? Fine. So they are named it as stereotype annotation. So because Spring is making those classes as simplified, Spring is simplifying our classes. So that's why they are calling it as stereotype. So you see in the package name also, they mentioned it as a stereotype. If you go to user DAO having a repository annotation is belongs to stereotype. Those are stereotype annotations. So to represent our classes as Spring Beans, we are going to use it. Perfect. All of you clear with this my point? All of you clear with my point? Yep. Fine, guys. Good. Next one, we need to understand how to work with the auto wiring. how to work with auto wiring in this Spring Boot. Auto wiring, right? Fine. Before going to start this auto wiring, guys, you see here, I have created so many packages. I have created so many classes. Am I doing any XML configuration to manage these classes? I have created so many packages. I have created so many classes. Am I writing any XML to represent these classes as Spring Beans? No, we are representing everything as annotation. Whatever the configurations that we need to do, we are managing everything by using annotations. In this entire project, am I writing a logic to start IOC container? Am I starting the IOC container? Am I doing any configurations to start the IOC container? Am I doing anything to perform the component scanning? Everything is automated. Everything is automated. Everything will be taken care by run method and the Spring Boot application annotation. So now here we are focusing on the configuration part, or we are focusing on only our business logic implementation? Are we focusing on I need to create a XML, in the XML o configure karo, o XML ka tag ka syntax check karo? Am I doing that things, are I'm focusing only on the business logic implementation? I am focusing only on the business logic implementation. Now, can you tell me what is a Spring Boot now? What is the definition of the Spring Boot? Can you tell me what is the definition of Spring Boot now? Come on, guys. What is the definition of Spring Boot? People are not responding. Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. So now, whatever the statement I explained you, Spring Boot is one approach to develop the Spring application with less configuration. Now, can you believe that statement is true? Can you believe that statement is true? Yes. We are able to develop one Spring application without making any configurations. That is that configuration, whatever is required, whatever the configuration that is required, it is taken care by Spring Boot. The main advantage of the Spring Boot is auto configuration. Can you guys tell me what is auto configuration? What is auto configuration? It will identify the configuration which is required for the project, and it will provide that configuration. Auto configuration means Spring Boot will identify the configuration which is required for the application, and it will provide that configuration for us. That is called auto configuration. You no need to start the IOC container. You no need to create the objects. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. That is auto configuration. Very good. Next one, auto wiring. What is auto wiring? The process of identifying dependent object and injecting into target object is called as auto wiring. Dependency injection. Auto wiring is used to perform dependency injection in our Spring based applications. Auto wiring is used to perform dependency injection. What is dependency injection? The process of injecting one class object into another class object. The process of injecting one class object into another class object is called as dependency injection. The process of injecting one class object into another class object is called as dependency injection. Here in Spring Framework, IOC container, in Spring Framework, IOC container will perform dependency injection. will perform dependency injection. We can give instruction to IOC to perform the dependency injection in two ways. One is manual wiring, second one is auto wiring. We can give instructions. We will provide instructions to IOC to perform DI in two ways. What are those two ways we are going to inform the IOC to perform the dependency injection? One is manual wiring. Using ref attribute in beans config file XML, beans config XML file. Second one is by using auto wiring. Okay, auto wiring is used to perform dependency injection, guys. Auto wiring is used to perform dependency injection. The process of injecting one class object into another class object is called as dependency injection. In the Spring framework, who is going to perform the dependency injection? In the Spring framework, IOC container will perform dependency injection. We will provide the instruction to IOC to perform the dependency injection in two ways. One is by using manual wiring, second one is by using auto wiring. So auto wiring means it will identify, auto wiring means IOC will identify dependent object and it will inject into target object. Auto wiring means IOC will identify dependent object and it will inject into target object. Auto wiring will use below modes to perform the dependency injection. Auto wiring will use below modes to perform dependency injection. We already discussed in the core concepts. What are the modes it is using? One is by name, second one is by type. By name and by type. And there is another mode called constructor. Internally it will use by type. Internally it will use by type only. These are the modes of the auto wiring which are used to perform dependency injection. To perform the auto wiring, we will use @auto wide annotation. To perform auto wiring, we will use @auto wide annotation. Auto wide annotation we can use at three places. Target locations are three. Auto wide annotation we can use at three places in the program. One is variable level, setter method level, and the third one is constructor level. That means field injection, setter injection, constructor injection. If you keep it at the variable level, then it is called as field injection. If you keep at the setter method level, this is called as setter injection. Field injection nothing but FI. Field injection, setter injection nothing but SI. Constructor injection nothing but CI. So how many ways we can perform the auto wiring now? We can perform the auto wiring in three ways: setter injection, constructor injection, and field injection. What is this auto wiring? Auto wiring is used to perform dependency injection. The process of injecting one class object into another class object is called as dependency injection. In the Spring framework, IOC container will perform dependency injection. We will provide the instructions to IOC to perform the dependency injection in two ways. One is by using manual wiring. In the XML file, we will configure the ref attribute to perform the dependency injection. If you are not using the XML, then we can go for annotation based auto wiring. Auto wiring means IOC will identify the dependent object and it will inject into target object. Auto wiring will work based on modes. Auto wiring will use below modes to perform dependency injection. By name mode, by type mode. So already we discussed what is by name and by type. Based on the name of the variable, it will identify the dependent object by name. By name means based on the name of the variable, it will identify the dependent. By type means based on the data type of the variable, it will identify the dependent object. Constructor. Constructor will use internally by type only. So to perform this auto wiring, we will use @auto wide annotation. Auto wide annotation we can use at three places in our program. Auto wide annotation we can specify at three places in our program. One is variable level, second one is a setter method level, third one is a constructor level. When you use it at the variable level, it is called as a field injection. When you use at the setter method level, it is called as a setter injection. When you use at the constructor, it is called as a constructor injection. Are you guys clear with this point? Introduction for auto wiring. So in the tomorrow session, we are going to work with this auto wiring with these three methods: variable level, setter method level, and constructor level.